Rome, the year 96 of our era. The city held its breath, but this was not the reverent silence that fills temple. It was the silence before a storm, the silence of a predator stalking its prey. The air, damp and cold with an October chill and the smell of wet tuff, seemed electrified with fear and a suppressed, almost criminal hope. Just moments ago, in his own chambers on the Palatine Hill, the life of Emperor Domitian, the last of the Flavian dynasty, had been cut short. His 15-year reign, which had begun with hope, had descended into an endless polar night of paranoia, denunciations, and executions. He had been stabbed like a wild beast, and the news of it, spreading through the marble streets like wildfire, brought elation to some and panic-stricken terror to others. The Senate, humiliated and bled dry by decades of repression, hastily, almost convulsively, proclaimed the elderly and childless Marcus Cocceius Nerva as the new princeps. It was a compromise, a temporary measure, and a desperate attempt to prevent chaos and a new civil war, the specter of which already hovered over the 7 hills. In the last years of Domitian's reign, Rome had become a theater of shadows, where every rustle could signify a denunciation and every careless phrase a death sentence. The emperor, the younger son of the deified Vespasian and brother of the popular Titus, had begun his journey as a promising ruler, but gradually sank into an abyss of suspicion that grew into a bloody tyranny. He demanded to be addressed as Lord and God, which in Latin sounds like Dominus et Deus. His statues of gold and silver flooded the capital, offending traditional Roman restraint. The Senate was stripped of all real influence, becoming a pliant instrument for legalizing repression. In the hall of the Curia, senators sat with stone faces, afraid to meet each other's gaze, for they did not know which neighbor would write a denunciation that very night. The atmosphere in the city was suffocating. Aristocrats avoided public gatherings, and philosophers such as the famous Stoic Epictetus were expelled from Rome as carriers of dangerous freethinking that could question the divinity of power. A network of professional informers, known as delatores, had ensnared all strata of society, turning friends into enemies and relatives into accusers. These people, who received a share of their victims' confiscated property, were a true cancer on the body of the state. Their activities destroyed the very fabric of Roman society, its foundation called fides, that is, trust, which was the bedrock of all social and business relations. Now everyone was afraid to speak frankly, even with their loved ones, and friendly feasts turned into formal gatherings where every word was weighed. Even members of his own family fell victim to his paranoia, such as his cousin Titus Flavius Clemens. He was executed on a vague charge of atheism, which may have concealed sympathy for Judaism or the growing power of Christianity. It was in this poisonous environment that a conspiracy matured in which personal revenge and fear for one's own life were intertwined. Even those closest to the emperor, including his wife Domitia Longina, who, according to the historian Cassius Dio, discovered her own name on her husband's latest proscription list, were involved. 2 prefects of the Praetorian Guard, Petronius Secundus and Norbanus, also joined the plot, realizing that the same fate awaited them. The murder was carried out boldly and brutally. The manager of the imperial estates, Stephanus, feigning a hand injury and wearing it in a sling for several days. To lull the guard's vigilance, concealed a dagger under the bandage. Entering the chambers under the pretext of reporting a conspiracy, he handed the emperor a scroll and, while he was reading, struck the first blow in the groin. The wounded Domitian, possessing immense physical strength, engaged in a desperate struggle, but other conspirators, emerging from hiding, immediately set upon him. They finished him off with 7 blows. And so the tyrant fell. The Senate immediately voted for damnatio memoriae, which means a condemnation of memory. This was a ritual of total oblivion, a legal and symbolic act of erasing a person from history. It was not just the toppling of statues. Domitian's name was meticulously chiseled off monuments throughout the empire from Britain to Egypt. His name was erased from official documents and Senate records. His portraits were destroyed, his coins were melted down. Even private inscriptions that mentioned the hated emperor were subject to alteration. It was an attempt to erase 15 years of history. But the power vacuum proved no less terrible than the tyranny itself. The Praetorian Guard, the elite of the Roman army, spoiled by the largesse of Domitian, who had increased their pay by a third and often personally led them into battle, had no intention of forgiving the murder of their patron. The guardsmen looked upon the new Princeps Nerva with open contempt. To them, he was merely a senatorial mimra, an old man with no military authority and childless, which made his position as fragile as a house of cards. Soon their grumbling grew into open mutiny. In the autumn of 97, the guardsmen, under the furious leadership of their prefect Casperius Aelianus, surrounded the imperial palace. The scene was one of humiliating drama. Nerva, old and frail, tried to appeal to their conscience, bared his neck, and offered his life in exchange for order. But the guardsmen were adamant. They demanded blood, that is, the surrender of the conspirators who had dared to raise a hand against the divine Flavius. Nerva was broken. The murderers of his predecessor, whom he had tried to protect, were seized and torn to pieces, and the authority of the Princeps himself was trampled in the dust of the Forum. Casperius Aelianus forced the emperor to publicly thank the Guard for this act of justice, turning the ruler of the greatest empire in the world into a pathetic puppet. At this moment of humiliation in the quiet of the Palatine Palace offices, the elderly emperor made a decision that would forever change the trajectory of the Roman Empire. He understood that he needed not just an heir. He needed a shield, a sword, and an unbreakable will embodied in one man. He needed someone who would inspire awe in the Praetorians and respect in the legions, who could, by his reputation and strength, cement the shaken structure of power. And his gaze turned far from the intrigues of the Eternal City, to the north, to the misty frontiers of the empire, to the Rhine limes. There, in the harsh conditions of constant military threat, a governor of Upper Germany commanded the legions. He was a middle-aged man with a face weathered by campaign winds and a reputation as a flawless soldier and a just commander. He was not a native of Italy. His ancestors came from a distant Spanish province. He did not belong to the most ancient Roman aristocracy, but steel tempered on the fields of battle flowed in his veins, and his name was already spoken with respect in the tents of legionaries from Britain to Syria. His name was Marcus Ulpius Traianus. No one yet knew that this provincial, this soldier to the core, was destined not just to save Rome from another crisis, but to raise it to an unprecedented height, to expand its borders to their limits, and to enter history under a name that would become synonymous with the ideal ruler. Optimus Princeps, the best of emperors. This is the story of his life, his wars, his great achievements, and of the era that will forever remain in human memory as the Golden Age of Rome. Marcus Ulpius Traianus was born on September 18th of the year 53 of our era in the city of Italica, located in southern Spain. Today it is in the vicinity of modern Seville. The very fact of his birth was significant. He became the first Roman emperor to be born outside of Italy. This was not merely a geographical accident, but a reflection of deep changes in Roman society itself. The empire was ceasing to be just Rome. Ruling over conquered peoples, it was transforming into a single civilizational organism, where loyalty and merit meant more than birthplace. The province of Baetica was one of the most Romanized and prosperous parts of the empire. It was called the Happy Arabia of the West. The fertile valleys of the Baetis River, the modern Guadalquivir, yielded huge harvests of olives and grapes. Spanish olive oil, transported in thousands of amphorae stamped by their producers, fed Rome and its legions, and the local fish sauce, garum, was considered a delicacy on aristocratic tables. Silver, copper, and lead were mined from its depths. Spain gave Rome not only Trajan and Hadrian, but also such literary giants as Seneca and Lucan, which testifies to the highest level of cultural integration. The city of Italica, founded back in 205 BCE by the great Scipio Africanus as a settlement for veterans wounded in the wars with Carthage, was a true little Rome in Spain. It had its own temples, theaters, baths, magnificent mosaics, and wide paved streets. The city prided itself on its huge amphitheater, which could hold up to 25,000 spectators, a testament to its wealth and prestige. The Latin spoken here was of the purest kind, perhaps even more correct than in the multinational city of Rome itself. The Ulpian family to which Trajan belonged was not part of the ancient patrician aristocracy that traced its roots to the founders of Rome. They were descendants of those very Italic colonists who, several centuries earlier, had come to this land with weapons in hand. This was a new nobility, a nobility of the sword and service, whose position was based not on the antiquity of their lineage, but on loyal service to the state. The future emperor's father, Marcus Ulpius Traianus the Elder, was a prime example of this new elite. He made a brilliant military and political career, the so-called cursus honorum, rising from legionary to senator and consul. Under Emperor Vespasian, he was governor of Syria, one of the key and richest eastern provinces, where he successfully commanded legions during the First Jewish War, suppressing the last pockets of resistance. This was not just an honorable post, but a huge responsibility, as Syria was a launching pad for confrontation with the Parthian Empire and the center of all Eastern trade. Trajan the Elder's success in this post secured for the Ulpian family a reputation as reliable and competent administrators. For his services, he was awarded triumphal ornaments, or in Latin, ornamenta triumphalia, the highest military award available to a non-emperor. His success and impeccable reputation opened the doors to high society for his son as well. Trajan's mother was Marcia, a woman from a noble Roman family, which also strengthened the family's position. Trajan also had an older sister, Ulpia Marciana, for whom he maintained a deep affection and respect throughout his life, later deifying her after her death. The future emperor's childhood was spent in an atmosphere of pride in the Roman name, military valor, and the understanding that the path to the top lay through diligent and honest service. From his youth, he absorbed the idea that being a Roman was not a right by birth, but a duty that had to be proven by deeds. Following family tradition, Trajan chose a military career. It was a natural and the only possible path for a young aristocrat of his disposition. He began his service as a military tribune, or tribunus laticlavius, which was the standard first step for the scions of senatorial families and involved learning the art of command under an experienced legate. He spent 10 years in the legions, and this was no sinecure in quiet garrisons. His service took place on the most restless frontiers of the empire. He served under his father in Syria, where he became intimately familiar with Rome's eternal rival, the Parthian Empire, and on the Rhine, where the legions held back the constant pressure of Germanic tribes like the Chatti, Usipetes, and Tencteri. The Rhine frontier, or Limes Germanicus, was a complex system of forts, watchtowers, and roads requiring constant vigilance and readiness to repel barbarian raids. Life here was harsh: damp, cold, rough woolen clothing, constant patrols, and construction work. It was here that Trajan learned to appreciate engineering as the basis of military success. These were the years that shaped him as a person and as a commander. Unlike many aristocrats, Trajan did not shy away from the hardships of a soldier's life. Ancient historians like Cassius Dio and Pliny the Younger unanimously paint a picture of an ideal military leader. He was tall, well-built, and possessed immense physical strength and endurance. But most importantly, he shared all difficulties with his soldiers. He made multi-kilometer marches in full gear, weighing over 30 kilograms at the head of the column. He ate the same simple food as the rank-and-file legionaries: porridge, hardtack, and sour wine, and knew many of his centurions and veterans by name. He personally inspected posts, checked the condition of fortifications and hospitals, called valetudinaria, and tasted the water and food intended for the soldiers. He swam and hunted with them, participated in training fights, demonstrating masterful weapon skills. He wore the same military sandals, caligae, as the common soldiers, and personally took part in engineering works, whether it was building a bridge or digging a ditch. Such behavior differed sharply from the haughty arrogance of many commanders and earned him boundless love and respect in the army. The soldiers saw in him not just a superior, but one of them, a father commander or pater militum who cared for them but demanded iron discipline. He was strict but fair, and his authority was based not on fear but on deep respect. These years on the frontier taught him not only tactics and strategy but also an understanding of the common soldier's psychology, the ability to manage huge masses of people and to make quick decisions in critical situations. It was a school that no philosophical academy in Rome could provide. Trajan's political career progressed slowly but steadily. He successively held the offices of questor, responsible for finances, praetor, who performed judicial functions, and in the year 91, he reached the pinnacle of a senatorial career, becoming consul. All this happened during the reign of Domitian, a difficult and dangerous era. Domitian, suspicious and cruel, saw conspiracies everywhere, and the shadow of his disfavor could fall on anyone. Trajan, like many others, had to navigate carefully, demonstrating unconditional loyalty and keeping a low profile, not attracting undue attention. The key moment that brought Trajan to the forefront was the revolt of Antonius Saturninus, governor of Upper Germany, in January of 89. Saturninus, relying on two legions, namely the 14th Gemina and the 21st Rapax, proclaimed himself emperor. This was a direct threat to Domitian's power, provoked by his own tyranny and repressions against senators. Trajan at this time commanded the 7th Gemina Legion in Hispania Tarraconensis. Upon receiving the order, he unhesitatingly marched with his troops to suppress the rebellion. He force-marched towards the Rhine through the Pyrenees and Gaul. However, when he arrived, the revolt had already been crushed by troops loyal to Domitian under the command of Aulus Bucius Lapius Maximus, governor of Lower Germany. A sudden thaw caused the Rhine to break up, preventing Saturninus's German allies from coming to his aid, and the mutiny was quickly defeated. The rebellious 21st Rapax Legion was later sent to Pannonia, where it was almost completely destroyed in battles with the Sarmatians, serving as a lesson to the entire army. Although Trajan did not manage to take part in the battle, the very fact of his swift reaction and unconditional loyalty, in Latin fides, did not go unnoticed. Domitian, who always valued loyalty in the army, especially after such a shock, remembered the energetic Spaniard. This event taught Domitian two things: not to trust governors commanding more than one legion, and to value men like Trajan. As a reward for his loyalty, Trajan received an appointment to one of the most responsible posts in the empire. He became governor of Upper Germany, the very province where the mutiny had just broken out. This was a sign of the highest trust. Domitian entrusted him with strengthening the Rhine frontier and keeping in check the legions that were considered not entirely reliable. It was at this post in Mogontiacum, modern Mainz, far from Rome, that Trajan would receive the news that would change his life. Thus ended one era, and Rome froze in anxious expectation. In the year 97, the city was like a dormant volcano. The eruption of Domitian's tyranny had ceased, but under the thin crust of Nerva's senatorial rule, molten lava was seething. The old emperor, placed on the throne as a temporary figure, realized with horror that his power was ephemeral. The army, especially the Praetorian Guard, despised him for his weakness, and in the Senate, underhand games for the right of succession had already begun. Nerva, an experienced jurist and administrator but not a soldier, understood. He needed not just a successor, he needed a savior. His gaze, full of despair and hope, turned far to the north, where on the banks of the Rhine stood a man whose reputation was stronger than the walls of any city. The choice was made. Nerva's reign was overshadowed from the start by his main weakness, a lack of support from the army. The Praetorians, the emperor's personal guard, accustomed to Domitian's generosity and iron hand, looked upon the aged senator with ill-concealed contempt. They had neither forgotten nor forgiven the murder of their patron. In the autumn of 97, their discontent erupted into open mutiny. Led by their prefect Casperius Aelianus, the Praetorians surrounded the imperial palace on the Palatine. Their demand was an ultimatum: to hand over for execution Petronius Secundus and Parthenius, the organizers of the conspiracy against Domitian, whom Nerva had taken under his protection. The situation was critical. Nerva had no forces to oppose his own guard. He tried to reason with the mutineers, even bared his chest to their swords, but all was in vain. In the end, the emperor was forced into a humiliating capitulation. The conspirators were dragged from the palace and torn to pieces before the eyes of all Rome. Moreover, Casperius Aelianus forced Nerva to publicly deliver a speech of thanks, in which he praised the Praetorians for their loyalty and justice. It was an indelible disgrace. The emperor's power, his authority, was destroyed. Everyone in Rome understood that the Princeps was merely a puppet in the hands of armed soldiers. Nerva realized that without the support of the legions, his days and possibly hours were numbered. He urgently needed an heir with an impeccable military reputation, a man whose very name would make the Praetorians freeze. In this desperate situation, Nerva made a brilliant political move that would determine the fate of Rome for the next 100 years. This was the principle of adoption of the best. Instead of passing power by blood kinship, which often brought unworthy rulers like Caligula or Nero to the throne, he decided to choose the most worthy man in the empire and make him his son and co-ruler. This idea was not entirely new. Augustus had adopted Tiberius, but it was Nerva and Trajan who turned it into a working system, giving rise to the era of the 5 good emperors. It was a rejection of the dynastic principle in favor of meritocracy, that is, rule by merit. The choice fell on Trajan. This was not a spontaneous decision. Trajan was known as a talented military commander, popular with the troops, respected in the Senate for his father's merits, and, importantly, he commanded a powerful group of troops on the strategically vital German front. His candidacy was ideal. Nerva's choice was likely influenced by a group of influential senators, the so-called Spanish Party, which included figures like Lucius Licinius Sura, a close friend of Trajan who became his chief advisor. Moreover, Trajan had no children of his own, which precluded the immediate establishment of a new dynasty and emphasized the meritocratic nature of the choice. In October of 97, during a solemn ceremony on the Capitoline Hill, in the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, Nerva publicly announced his decision. Addressing the gods and the people of Rome, he uttered the historic phrase, "May this be for the good of the Senate, the Roman people, and myself. I adopt Marcus Ulpius Trajanus." He immediately granted Trajan the title of Caesar and then Augustus, and also endowed him with tribunician power, making him effectively his co-ruler. A messenger was sent to Germany to Trajan's headquarters in Mogontiacum with a symbolic gift, a diamond, a sign of the transfer of power. This messenger, by the way, was a distant relative of Trajan and his future successor, Publius Aelius Hadrianus. Trajan received the news with his characteristic calm and dignity. He did not rush to Rome to enjoy his new position. He remained at his post, demonstrating that the security of the borders was more important to him than the honors of the capital. This gesture was appreciated by all. It showed that the new heir was a man of duty, not of vain glory. His first order in his new status was a command that showed his iron grip. He summoned the Praetorian prefect Casperius Aelianus and the leaders of the mutiny to him in Germany, ostensibly for a new appointment or to report. The Praetorians, not daring to disobey a direct order from the co-emperor, who now possessed the full military authority in Latin Imperium Maius, arrived on the Rhine. There, without much fuss, they were dismissed from their posts and executed. With this single stroke, Trajan avenged Nerva's humiliation, restored discipline, and showed the entire empire who was now the real power. The Praetorian Guard was pacified. The crisis was over. On January 28, 98, the aged Nerva died of a stroke after a reign of just 16 months. The Senate, without the slightest hesitation, confirmed Trajan's powers as sole ruler. News of his adoptive father's death found Trajan still on the German frontier. And again, he showed no haste. Instead of immediately setting off for the capital for honors, he devoted almost 2 years to inspecting the Rhine and Danube limes. This was a wise and far-sighted decision. He was demonstrating to the Senate and the people that his priority was the security of the empire. He personally acquainted himself with the state of affairs in the most important border provinces, making it clear that his rule would be based on knowledge of the real situation, not on palace rumors. During this time, he founded new settlements for veterans such as Ulpia Noviomagus, modern Nijmegen, and Colonia Ulpia Traiana Xanten. He reorganized the defense system, dividing the province of Germania into upper and lower. He strengthened the frontier, creating the so-called Agri Decumates, an area between the upper reaches of the Rhine and Danube protected by a chain of forts. He concluded alliances with border tribes, checked the combat readiness of the legions, and put provincial administration in order. His slow, thorough journey to Rome was a triumphal procession, but not in a military but in an administrative sense. He was establishing order, settling disputes, and appointing competent officials. When in the autumn of 99 Trajan finally entered Rome, he was greeted as a savior. But here, too, he behaved modestly, which completely won the hearts of the Romans. Instead of entering the city in a chariot accompanied by a lavish retinue, he entered the capital on foot, greeting senators and common citizens. He shook hands with acquaintances and stopped to talk with veterans. His wife, Pompeia Plotina, a woman known for her modesty and intelligence as she ascended the steps of the imperial palace, turned to the crowd and said, "I enter here such as I would wish to leave here." These words, full of modesty and dignity, spread throughout the city. Soon the imperial couple was joined by Trajan's sister, Ulpia Marciana, along with her daughter Matidia. They all led a modest lifestyle, in stark contrast to the luxury and debauchery of previous courts, strengthening the emperor's image as first among equals. Rome breathed a sigh of relief. The era of fear and uncertainty was over. A man who combined the strength of a warrior, the wisdom of an administrator, and the modesty of a citizen had ascended the throne. The era of Trajan had begun. Rome held its breath in anticipation. A soldier, a man of camps and battlefields, had ascended the Palatine Hill. The city whose memory bore the scars of Caligula's caprices, Nero's cruelty, and Domitian's paranoia, watched the new ruler with trepidation. Would he be another tyrant ruling by the sword and fear? Or was the capital finally in luck? The answer Trajan gave surpassed the wildest expectations. He began not with prescriptions and executions, but with painstaking and tireless work to restore the state, proving himself not only a great commander, but also the wisest of administrators, whose actions would for centuries define the ideal of a good emperor. Trajan's first and most important step was to restore normal relations with the Senate. He understood that the stability of the empire depended on harmonious cooperation between the princeps and the aristocracy. Unlike Domitian, who saw senators only as potential conspirators, Trajan saw them as partners in governing the state. Arriving in Rome, he appeared in the Curia and publicly swore that no senator would be executed without a fair trial by the Senate itself. This was an unheard-of guarantee of security for a class accustomed to living in constant fear. He demonstratively rejected the services of informers or delatores, who had been a true scourge under his predecessors. Moreover, the most odious of them were arrested, put on hastily built, unreliable ships, and sent out to sea at the mercy of the waves. This gesture was both symbolic and extremely popular with the people. He addressed the senators with marked respect, calling them father senators and often consulting with them on important issues. He personally attended meetings, participated in debates, allowed himself to disagree, and even to lose arguments. Of course, this was a calculated policy, as real power was entirely in his hands. But the form itself, the style of communication, created the illusion of a revived republic, which incredibly flattered the senatorial aristocracy. His friend Pliny the Younger, in his panegyric to Trajan, enthusiastically described how the emperor called on senators to speak freely, saying, "Speak your minds boldly, for I am here to listen." In response to this, in the year 100, the Senate awarded him the honorary title Optimus Princeps, meaning best of rulers, which no one before him had borne. This title, unlike the victory titles Germanicus or Dacicus, spoke not of his military successes but of his civic virtues. It became part of his official titulature and was minted on coins. One of Trajan's most outstanding and far-sighted initiatives was the program known as the Alimenta, which literally translates as provisions or sustenance. This was, in essence, the first state system of social support and long-term investment in history. The program's essence was brilliant in its simplicity and dual benefit. The state created special funds from which it provided long-term, low-interest loans, usually at 5% per annum, to small and medium landowners in Italy. The land itself served as collateral. This allowed farmers to invest in their farms, improve land cultivation, and buy new equipment and livestock, which stimulated agricultural production throughout Italy, which by then had begun to lag behind more fertile provinces like Egypt and Africa. This measure was also aimed at combating the demographic crisis and falling birth rates among the Italic population, which was considered the backbone of the army and the state. But the main thing was something else. The interest paid by landowners on these loans did not go back to the imperial treasury but was directed to local municipalities. This money was intended for monthly payments for the maintenance and education of children from poor families, as well as orphans. Thus, Trajan solved several problems at once. Firstly, he fought poverty and depopulation by providing sustenance and giving a chance for the future to the most vulnerable segment of the population. For a poor family, a monthly 16 sesterces for a boy was substantial support, allowing not only for better nutrition but also for giving the child a basic education instead of sending him to hard labor from a young age. Secondly, he supported agriculture by strengthening the class of small proprietors, the foundation of Roman society and the army. And thirdly, he was raising future citizens and soldiers, investing in human capital and ensuring that the empire would always have healthy and literate recruits for the legions and taxpayers for the treasury. The scale of the program was enormous, covering dozens of cities throughout Italy. Archaeological finds such as the bronze tablet from Velleia have brought us detailed reports on the functioning of this system. In Velleia, for example, a fund of 1,140,000 sesterces supported 246 boys and 34 girls who received monthly payments of 16 and 12 sesterces respectively. The Alimenta program became a prime example of Trajan's paternalistic policy. His desire to be not just a ruler, but a father to his people, a pater patriae. Nothing spoke of Rome's power and prosperity like its architecture. Trajan, using colossal wealth, including that later captured in Dacia, launched an unprecedentedly large-scale construction program in the capital and throughout the empire. His goal was not just to beautify the city, but also to improve the lives of its citizens by creating new public infrastructure. The chief architect and engineer of this era was the brilliant Syrian Apollodorus of Damascus, whom the emperor greatly valued. Their tandem was incredibly productive. Trajan set grandiose tasks, and Apollodorus found brilliant engineering and artistic solutions for them. The pinnacle of his construction activity was Trajan's Forum, opened in the year 112. It was the largest and most luxurious of all the imperial fora. To make space for it, workers performed a true miracle of engineering. They leveled a part of the Quirinal Hill's slope, almost 40 meters high. The forum itself was a gigantic square surrounded by colonnades and paved with white marble. In the center stood a gilded equestrian statue of the emperor. The square was enclosed by the grandiose Basilica Ulpia. This was a huge 5-aisled building decorated with multicolored marble and reliefs, serving for business meetings and court sessions. Behind the basilica were 2 libraries, one for Greek and the other for Latin scrolls, and between them, as the semantic and compositional center of the entire ensemble, rose the famous Trajan's Column. This column, unveiled in the year 113, is a unique monument, without parallel in world art. The nearly 40-meter-high monument, composed of 20 blocks of Carrara marble, was completely covered with a spiral frieze of reliefs about 200 meters long. These reliefs, like a giant stone comic strip, told the detailed story of the 2 Dacian Wars. They depict over 2,500 figures, Roman legionaries building bridges and camps, fighting the enemy, Trajan himself addressing the troops and their Dacian opponents. We see specific scenes. The river god Danube blesses the Romans crossing. Trajan performs a ritual sacrifice. Legionaries build a camp with astonishing precision. Dacian women torture Roman prisoners, emphasizing the cruelty of the war. The column was not just a triumphal monument. It also served as a mausoleum, for after Trajan's death, the urn with his ashes was placed in its base. Next to the Forum, Apollodorus built Trajan's Market. This was a multi-level complex of brick and concrete, a kind of ancient shopping center. It included over 150 shops, taverns, and administrative offices located on several floors along the hillside. This complex not only solved commercial problems, but also served as a giant retaining wall for the excavated hill. In addition, Trajan built huge baths on the Esquiline Hill, on the site where Nero's Golden House once stood, symbolically returning to the people the land usurped by the tyrant. But Trajan built not only in Rome. New roads were laid throughout the empire, for example, the famous Via Traiana, which paralleled the Appian Way, aqueducts, like the Aqua Traiana in Rome, and bridges such as the bridge at Alcantara in Spain with the inscription, "I will stand for eternity," were built. Port facilities were also constructed in Ostia and Ancona. In Ostia, Rome's main port, a giant hexagonal basin was dug which protected ships from storms and guaranteed an uninterrupted supply of grain to Rome. This bustling construction activity provided work for thousands of people, improved communications, and contributed to economic prosperity. Trajan was not just a builder, but also a scrupulous administrator who delved into all the details of governing a vast empire. A unique insight into his approach to justice and provincial administration is provided by his surviving correspondence with his friend and governor of the province of Bithynia and Pontus, Pliny the Younger. Pliny, faced with a complex problem, would write to the emperor asking for advice. Trajan would reply, usually briefly but always to the point. This correspondence covers a wide range of issues, from financial audits in cities and the construction of aqueducts to disputes over the status of foundlings and Pliny's proposal to organize a fire brigade in Nicomedia. Trajan rejected the latter proposal, fearing that any such association, or collegium, could turn into a political club called a heteria, which demonstrates his caution. The most famous of their letters concern the Christians. Pliny, encountering followers of the new religion for the first time, did not know how to deal with them. He asked whether they should be punished simply for the name of being a Christian, or only for specific crimes. Should anonymous denunciations be accepted? Trajan's response became the basis of Roman policy towards Christians for the next century and a half. It was pragmatic and devoid of fanaticism. Firstly, Christians should not be sought out. Secondly, anonymous denunciations must not be accepted, for this sets a bad example and is not in keeping with the spirit of our times. Thirdly, if a Christian is officially denounced and admits to being one, he should be persuaded to recant by sacrificing to the Roman gods. Fourthly, those who persist should be executed not for their religious beliefs, but for obstinacy and disobedience, in Latin contumacia, to the authorities. And fifthly, those who have recanted should be immediately pardoned and released. This response demonstrates Trajan's legalistic mind. He did not see Christians as a serious political threat, but demanded unconditional obedience to Roman law and authority. His reign, therefore, was an era of order, justice, and prosperity. He laid the administrative and social foundation upon which Rome's power rested and prepared the empire for the greatest conquests in its history. Beyond the Danube, in the misty Carpathian mountains where modern Romania now lies, a storm was brewing. There ruled Decebalus, king of the Dacians, a figure of epic proportions. He was not a wild barbarian chieftain. He was a nation-builder, a cunning diplomat, and a brilliant strategist who had united disparate tribes into a powerful state. He had once humiliated Rome, forcing Emperor Domitian to pay him tribute. For Trajan, a soldier to the core, such a situation was unbearable. The honor of Rome demanded vengeance. The security of the borders required the elimination of the threat, and the treasury demanded the untold riches of the Dacian gold mines. The clash of the two titans, Trajan and Decebalus, was preordained, and this war would become one of the most brutal and grandiose in the history of the Roman Empire. Formerly, peace existed between Rome and Dacia, but it was a peace shameful for Rome, concluded by Domitian in the year 89 after an unsuccessful military campaign. According to its terms, Decebalus recognized himself as a client of Rome, but in reality Rome was obliged to pay him annual subsidies and to supply him with military engineers and craftsmen. Decebalus wisely used Roman money and technology to strengthen his own army and build a powerful system of fortresses in the Orostia Mountains. Dacian society was militarized and their religion, linked to the cult of the god Zalmoxis, who promised immortality, made their warriors fearless in battle. Decebalus was turning Dacia into a unified state, posing a constant threat to Rome's rich Danubian provinces. Trajan, even as a governor, had clearly seen this danger. For him, the war with Dacia was conditioned by three key factors. The first was the restoration of honor, or dignitas. Rome could not tolerate the humiliating status of being a tributary to a barbarian king. Victory over Decebalus was meant to wash away the shame of Domitian's defeats and establish the new emperor's prestige. The second factor was strategic security. The Dacian wedge, protruding into Roman possessions on the Danube, was a constant source of instability. Decebalus could at any moment cut the most important land communications between the western and eastern parts of the empire. The complete subjugation of Dacia was intended to secure the frontier for many decades to come. And the third, no less important factor was economic benefit. Dacia was fabulously rich in natural resources, primarily gold and silver. Trajan, planning grandiose construction projects and social programs, needed money. The capture of the Dacian mines could solve Rome's financial problems for many years. Preparations for the war began almost immediately after Trajan came to power. Huge forces up to 15 legions, which constituted almost half of the entire Roman army, were concentrated on the Danube frontier. Among them were such celebrated units as the 1st Minervia Legion, the 4th Flavia Felix Legion, the 5th Macedonica, and the 13th Gemina. Roads were built, fortified camps were erected, and provisions and siege equipment were accumulated. Rome was preparing for a decisive showdown. In the spring of 101, Trajan personally led his legions across the Danube. To ferry the gigantic army, Roman engineers built 2 massive pontoon bridges. The Roman invasion proceeded in 2 main columns, which were to link up deep in enemy territory. Decebalus did not passively await the enemy. He was a master of guerrilla warfare and ambushes. The decisive battle took place at the mountain pass of Tapae, near the iron gates of Transylvania. The battle was incredibly fierce. The Dacians, armed with their fearsome 2-handed falk swords which easily cut through Roman armor and shield, fought with desperate courage. The Romans, to counter this weapon, were forced to upgrade their equipment on the fly. Cross braces were added to helmets, and a multi-segmented arm guard, the manica, was worn on the right arm. The Romans suffered heavy losses. But the iron discipline of the legions and the command genius of Trajan, who according to legend tore his own clothes for bandages for the wounded, ultimately brought victory. After the defeat at Tapae, Decebalus attempted a counterattack. In the winter of 101 and 102, when the Danube froze, he and allied Roxolani tribes crossed the river and invaded the province of Moesia, hoping to divert Trajan from his capital. But the emperor swiftly moved part of his forces south and, in fierce battles, including a night engagement, defeated the Dacian army. This victory was immortalized in the Grand Monument, the Tropaeum Traiani at Adamclisi. In the spring of 102, the Romans resumed their offensive on the Dacian capital, Sarmizegetusa. Step by step, fighting through a system of mountain fortresses, the legions approached the heart of the Dacian kingdom. Seeing the hopelessness of his position, Decebalus sued for peace. Trajan, whose army was also exhausted by the difficult campaign, agreed. The peace terms were harsh. Decebalus had to demolish the walls of his fortresses, surrender all siege engines and Roman deserters, renounce an independent foreign policy, and become a faithful ally of Rome. Trajan celebrated a triumph in Rome and took the victory title Dacicus. But Trajan did not believe in the durability of this peace. He knew that Decebalus's indomitable spirit was not broken, and he was right. Less than 3 years later, the Dacian king began to violate the terms of the treaty. He secretly rebuilt fortresses, rearmed his army, and attacked tribes allied with Rome. For Trajan, this was the last straw. This time, the goal was not just victory, but the complete and final destruction of the Dacian kingdom and its transformation into a Roman province. The war resumed in 105. To ensure an uninterrupted supply for his army, Trajan ordered Apollodorus of Damascus to build a permanent stone bridge across the Danube at Drobeta. It was a colossal structure over a kilometer long, supported by 20 massive stone piers built using caissons, that is, waterproof chambers. This was not just a bridge. It was a demonstration of Rome's technological superiority and indomitable will. This time, the Roman offensive was even more powerful and methodical. The legions in two pincers tightened the ring around the Orashtia mountain massif, where the main Dacian fortresses were located. The siege of the capital, Sarmizegetusa, became the climax of the war. The Romans used their entire arsenal of siege equipment: catapults, ballistae, siege towers, and battering rams. They even cut off the aqueduct supplying the city, which hastened its fall. After the walls were breached, fierce street fighting ensued. Before the city fell, the Dacian nobility, to avoid capture, committed mass suicide by taking poison at a final feast. This tragic scene is also depicted on the column. Decebalus himself, with a small group of followers, managed to break out of the encirclement. Trajan sent the best Roman cavalry in pursuit, hunted down, cornered the great Dacian king, to avoid the shame of capture, committed suicide by slitting his own throat. His severed head was brought to Trajan and then displayed for all to see on the Gemonian stairs in Rome. The Dacian kingdom had ceased to exist. Dacia was declared a Roman province. Its territory was subjected to total colonization. According to the historian Eutropius, colonists from all over the Roman world, in Latin, ex toto orbe Romano, were settled in the new lands to populate cities and cultivate fields. This was a deliberate policy of demographic replacement. An intensive Romanization of the local population began. The Latin language replaced Dacian, and it is on this basis that, centuries later, the modern Romanian language and the Romanian people, who still consider themselves descendants of Trajan and the Dacians, would form. A new provincial capital was founded, Colonia Ulpia Traiana, Augusta Dacia Sarmizegetusa. But the most important and immediate result of the war was the captured treasure. The Romans managed to find the legendary treasury of Decebalus, hidden, according to tradition, at the bottom of the Sargetia River. According to late antique historians, about 165 tons of gold and 330 tons of silver were seized. This golden rain poured into the Roman treasury. It allowed Trajan not only to cover all military expenses, but also to abolish taxes for citizens for an entire year. He staged grandiose games in the Colosseum, lasting 123 days, during which 10,000 gladiators fought and 11,000 wild animals were killed. And of course, he financed his colossal construction program, including the Forum and the Column, which became eternal monuments to his great victory. The empire had reached the peak of its economic and military power. The empire was bathed in the rays of glory and gold. The borders were securely protected, the treasury was bursting with Dacian treasures, and majestic structures were being erected in Rome. It seemed that a golden age had dawned, an era of peace and prosperity. But for a man like Trajan, whose soul was forged in the fire of battles, a peaceful lull could seem tedious. His gaze, no longer young but still consumed by an insatiable thirst for glory, turned to the east. There, beyond the Euphrates River, lay the lands of Rome's eternal rival, the Parthian Empire. He dreamed of surpassing Alexander the Great himself, of competing with a legend. This campaign would be his last, most ambitious, and most tragic enterprise. The rivalry between Rome and Parthia was a leitmotif of all Roman foreign policy for centuries. The memory of Crassus's shame, whose legions were annihilated at Carrhae, and whose eagles were captured by the enemy, still lived in the hearts of the Romans. Although a fragile compromise based on joint control over the buffer state of Armenia had been reached under Augustus and Nero, this region remained a constant bone of contention. The Parthian Empire, with its heavy cataphract cavalry and swift horse archers, was the only force capable of mounting a serious military challenge to the legions. The immediate pretext for the war, the casus belli, was the actions of the Parthian king Augustus. He had once again interfered in Armenian affairs, overthrowing the pro-Roman ruler and installing his own protege, Parthamasiris, on the throne. For Trajan, this was a direct violation of agreements and a challenge to Rome's authority. He could not leave it unanswered. But the emperor's true motives ran much deeper. Firstly, there was the thirst for glory, the imitation of Alexander, or imitatio Alexandri. Trajan was already over 60. He wanted to crown his reign with a great victory that would place him in the ranks of the greatest conquerors in history, primarily Alexander the Great. Secondly, there were economic interests. Control over Mesopotamia and access to the Persian Gulf would give Rome direct access to the maritime trade routes to India. This would allow for fabulous profits from the trade in spices, silk, and other luxury goods, bypassing Parthian middlemen. And thirdly, there was a strategic advantage. The final crushing of Parthia, which was torn by internal strife between different claimants to the throne, would eliminate the only great power capable of confronting Rome on equal terms and would permanently secure the eastern borders of the empire. In 113, after careful preparation, Trajan, at the head of a huge army, marched east. It was a campaign from which he would not return. The campaign began with a stunning success. In 114, Trajan invaded Armenia. The Parthian protege Parthomasiris, who came to the Roman camp to plead for recognition as king, was humiliated and soon died under mysterious circumstances. Trajan, without hesitation, declared Armenia a new Roman province. The following year, 115 Roman legions invaded northern Mesopotamia, also turning it into a province. During the winter, while the army was resting in Antioch, a terrible earthquake occurred, which nearly killed the emperor himself. He escaped by jumping out of a window and was forced to sleep in the open in the hippodrome for several days. This was considered a bad omen, but Trajan could no longer be stopped. In 116, the main phase of the campaign began. The Roman army, divided into two parts, moved south along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Parthian resistance was weak. Their state was torn by internal strife. One after another, the ancient cities of Babylon and Seleucia fell. Finally, the Romans entered the Parthian capital, Ctesiphon. King Osroes fled, leaving his golden throne and his daughter in Roman hands. Trajan had reached the apex of his triumph. He had brought his legions to the Persian Gulf, further than any Roman commander before him. Legend has it that standing on the shore and looking at a ship sailing towards India, the old emperor exclaimed with bitterness, "If I were younger, I would certainly sail to India." The Senate in Rome posthumously awarded him the title Parthicus and prepared for unprecedented celebrations. It seemed the age-old dream of conquering the East had come true. But it was at this very moment that the brilliant victory began to turn to dust. Trajan repeated the mistake of many great conquerors. He had gone too far, too fast. The conquered territories were not truly subdued. As soon as the legions left, rebellions flared up in their rear. All of Mesopotamia was in flames. Cities that had surrendered without a fight just yesterday now rose up and massacred the small Roman garrisons. Simultaneously, as if on command, a large-scale revolt of the Jewish diaspora broke out in Cyrenaica, Egypt, and Cyprus, known as the Second Jewish War or the Kitos War. The scale of this rebellion was terrifying. The rebels, driven by messianic expectations and hatred of Roman rule, destroyed temples and killed the Greek and Roman population with incredible cruelty. This revolt diverted significant Roman forces that were vitally needed in Mesopotamia. Trajan found himself in a trap. His supply lines were cut and a fire was raging in his rear. He was forced to turn back, brutally suppressing rebellions on his way. He tried to save the situation by placing a puppet king, Parthomaspates, on the Parthian throne, but this measure could no longer change anything. During the siege of the rebellious city of Hatra, located in the desert, the old emperor, personally participating in the assault, was nearly killed. His health, undermined by the hardships of the campaign, the heat, and possibly malaria, began to decline rapidly. in early 117, leaving the command in Mesopotamia to his legate Lucius Quietus, the sick and broken Trajan began his return journey to Rome. But he never reached the Eternal City. In the port city of Saturninus in Cilicia, on the southern coast of modern Turkey, he suffered a stroke. He died on August 8th or 9th, 117. His last will, according to the official version, was the adoption of his distant relative and governor of Syria, Publius Aelius Hadrianus. Although the circumstances of this adoption are still debated by historians, as the adoption documents were signed by Trajan's wife Plotina after his death, it was Hadrian who became his successor. The great era of conquests was over. The man was gone, but his name became a prayer, a standard against which all subsequent rulers would be measured. For centuries, upon the accession of a new emperor, the Senate would pronounce the ritual wish, Felicior Augusto, melior Traiano, which means, be luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan. But what was the true legacy of this titan born in a distant province? What was left after him? Just borders extended to their limits but unstable, or something greater? Forever imprinted on the fabric of Western civilization? The immediate result of Trajan's reign was the Roman Empire reaching its maximum territorial extent. From the misty shores of Scotland to the scorching sands of Arabia, from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the mountains of Armenia and the marshes of Mesopotamia, never before and never again would the power of Rome extend so far. However, this peak was fleeting. The very first decision of Trajan's successor, Hadrian, was to abandon the most recent and unstable conquests. He immediately withdrew the legions from Mesopotamia and Assyria, returning the border with Parthia to the Euphrates River. He also renounced direct rule over Armenia, restoring it to the status of a buffer kingdom. This step, which caused murmuring among many military hawks, was dictated by stark pragmatism. Hadrian understood what Trajan, in the heat of his last campaign, had refused to acknowledge. The empire had reached the natural limits of its expansion. Further expansion was not only economically disadvantageous but also militarily dangerous. The era of great conquests was replaced by an era of defense and consolidation of borders, symbolized by the famous Hadrian's Walls in Britain and Germany. Trajan's reign, thus, became not only the culmination but also a turning point in the history of Rome. If Trajan's military legacy proved ambiguous, his contribution to the development of the Roman state and society was truly colossal and enduring. He created the model of a good emperor. His partnership with the Senate, his concern for justice, his generosity towards the people, and his modesty in personal life became for centuries the standard by which other princeps were judged. The legend of his justice was so strong that even in the Middle Ages, Christian theologians like Dante Alighieri placed the soul of the pagan emperor in paradise, believing that Pope Gregory the Great had saved him from hell with his prayers. This legend is a striking testament to the power of his reputation. His Alimenta program was a revolutionary step in the social sphere, laying the foundations for state support for the needy and investment in the nation's future. The forum, market, bridges, and roads he built not only transformed Rome and the provinces, but also became the pinnacle of Roman engineering and architectural thought. His forum remained the center of Rome's public life for centuries, and Trajan's column still stands in the heart of the Eternal City to this day, a priceless historical source and a masterpiece of art. As the first provincial emperor, Trajan definitively established the principle that access to supreme power was open to the most worthy men from all corners of the empire, not just to natives of Italy. This strengthened the unity of the multinational state. Historians assess his reign differently. Some see him primarily as the last great conqueror, the embodiment of the Roman imperial spirit whose aggressive foreign policy brought the empire to the peak of its power. Others, on the contrary, emphasize his talents as an administrator, builder, and reformer, arguing that it was his domestic policy that made the 2nd century the golden age of Rome. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Trajan was a product of his era, an era when the glory of a commander was still considered the highest virtue of a ruler. His Dacian Wars were brutal but strategically necessary and economically profitable. His Parthian campaign was probably an act of imperial hubris, a mistake born of an excess of ambition. But even this failure cannot overshadow 2 decades of wise and just rule that brought the Roman Empire an unprecedented level of stability, prosperity, and order. The shadow of his colossal figure fell over all subsequent history. He left behind not just conquered provinces that could be lost, and not just gold that could be squandered. He left behind an idea, the idea that power can be strong but just, and a ruler can be both a fearsome warrior and a caring father to his people. And as long as his stone chronicle, the spiral of the column, stands in the center of Rome reaching for eternity, the memory of Marcus Ulpius Traianus, the soldier from Spain who became the best of emperors, will not fade. Thank you for spending this time with us, immersing yourselves in one of the most exciting eras in the history of ancient Rome. If you enjoyed this narrative, please support our channel. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions are the best reward for our work and an incentive to create new, even more detailed and captivating historical accounts. Until next time, on the pages of history.